there. First of all, I want to welcome everybody, and I see a new face in the crowd. Ed, can you tell us a little about yourself, why you're visiting, and welcome?
Yeah, thank you. I've been to the meetings before, and I'm a writer, short story writer. Haven't been published. Have submitted to the AHMM mysterious photograph contest. Never won it yet. Just got several honorable mentions. So, but I was reading mystery stories. Love them.
Okay, and where are you? Are you local?
Columbus, Georgia.
Oh, mercy. Well, I believe you've come to the right place today. Joseph is quite an accomplished short story writer, and we're hoping to learn from him. We typically
keep open.
Oh dear, perhaps I haven't had enough coffee this morning. We're going to save our business part of the meeting till after we hear what Joe has to say. And for those of you who don't know, Joseph S. Walker is a prolific short story writer. If you read Ellery Queen, if you read Alfred Hitchcock, Black Cat, if you have Mystery Magazine, if you read any of the short story anthologies that have come down the pike lately, you will find his stories in them. You will also find that he just churns these things, that he's like a machine. So he also doesn't live in Memphis, which we cannot fathom why there is anybody who doesn't live in Memphis. But here he also teaches literature, and I expect that several of his stories will talk about how a professor has murdered the student who turned in the essay about To Kill a Mockingbird. And I'm going to now turn it over to Joe. Thank you so much. Everybody, please mute so that we don't have any competition. Take it away, Joe. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Well, we'll assume this. I'm going to try to share a screen here. Can I do that? Aha. Okay. That's not my screen, but sorry.
That's okay. Hold on. I need to switch back. Come on, stop sharing. I was clicking multiple participants. There we go. Now you should be able to.
Okay. Okay. So is everyone seeing a screen now that says why and where and how?
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, so Jackie talked me up very kindly and, in my opinion, a little excessively. So I'm going to say here that I was asked to talk about how I write short stories, and as I was putting this presentation together, I came to realize that how I write short stories is kind of dependent on why and where I write short stories. So I've kind of organized this presentation around those three issues. Pardon me, because how I write is an offshoot of why I write, where I want my stories to appear. So you'll excuse me if I'm a little nervous getting started here. I feel honored to be here. So setting aside the basic desire to write, which I assume anyone here has that basic desire, I think it's important to have in mind what your personal goals are. My personal goals are to write and publish as many stories a year as I can. And just because it's the way I think about it, I want to publish those stories in magazines and anthologies where I know that an editor has said, yes, we want this story. So I have very little to say about novels. I have very little to say about self-publishing. I have nothing but respect for people who self-publish. It's a hard road to hoe. For me personally, getting past that editor, that's the hurdle that I want to jump. So that's what I focus on. So again, why write short crime fiction? The answer being to acquire riches beyond count, groupies, fame, all the usual stuff, Springsteen level, which is of course not true. The real answer is because it's fun. If you're not having fun doing this, there are a lot of other ways to spend your time, but writing should be fun. It's creative, it's playful, and everything about the way I write comes about because these are the things that make writing the most fun for me. So I encourage you to think about the things that make writing the most fun for you. To get into some more serious answers to this, why write short crime fiction? A lot of readers and writers agree with John Dixon Carr, who said that the short story is the form best suited to the mystery or crime narrative. That was perhaps more true back when mysteries, the kind of conventional wisdom is that short stories have shifted from being Sherlock Holmes or Agatha Christie style mysteries with a solution determined by the detective through the course of investigative work, more towards crime stories, which are simply any story involving crime. That's the definition that Otto Penzler uses in putting his annual collections together. There are still conventional, traditional mystery stories being written. I've tried to write some of them. There are a lot of different subcategories, the cozies, the noir, hard-boiled, but the basic idea that you have a crime and that singular event is the kind of breaking point in the world, kind of, to me, does suit the story naturally to short stories as opposed to novels. That said, pardon me, I've got nothing but respect again for people who write novels, but there are other reasons to write short crime fiction. Practice. It's a good opportunity, even if you're primarily interested in writing novels, to practice basic skills, which is fairly straightforward. Experimentation. This is something that I've been trying to do more and more. If you usually write in the third person, write in the first person. If you usually use the past tense, write in the present tense. That's something I've been trying to do, and I find it enormously challenging, but hopefully I'm building those muscles. When you're doing short stories, you can do a different thing in every short story, play with it, do things that you haven't done before. Similarly, variety and vanity. I'll freely admit that for me, one of the real rewards of doing this has been I've got a shelf where I put every magazine and every anthology that I appear in. And yeah, there's a level of gratification in seeing that shelf get longer. Networking, I think, is an important point. When you're writing short stories, publishing in magazines, publishing in anthologies, you're getting to meet a lot of editors. You're getting to meet a lot of your fellow writers, even if just virtually. And these are people who can be they can be friends, the personal thing. But they can also be helpful to your career, and they can give you more opportunities. And particularly once they know that you're somebody who can be relied upon to write well and to write what they need, this can open you up to new opportunities. Pardon me. Maybe the most important thing for me, or one of the most important things, is simplicity. By simplicity, I mean, if you're working on a novel, now, of course, there are people who can write a novel in 3 weeks, and we don't hate them at all. But for most people, writing a novel is a months-long process. if not a years-long process. And then even once you've written the novel, there are so many hurdles to jump over. Finding an agent, finding a publisher, going through editing, hoping that somebody will notice the book has been pushed out into the world. It's years, literally, working with this one story. I find writing short stories to be much more rewarding and much simpler because I work on a short story, I put it out into the world, and next week I'm working on something different. And it's not up to me to find an agent. It's not up to me to find a publisher. I do help with the promotion, of course, but it's just a way to make my writing life focus more on writing and less on the other things that come with writing. I hope that makes a certain amount of sense. So that's half of the puzzle, is why I write. These are the reasons that I write. The other half of the puzzle that determines what I write and how I write is, where do I want these stories to appear? Because again, the personal goals that I set, it's important to me that they do appear, that you know, there are people who are perfectly happy writing short stories and putting them in a drawer, and more power to them. But markets, this is kind of a troubling area, because the simple fact is there aren't as many markets as there used to be. And in particular, there aren't as many paying markets as there used to be. The internet has done to short fiction exactly what it's done in the realms of music and so many other areas. There's an audience out there, but getting to them is a little more difficult than it used to be. But there are things you can do. I strongly recommend the Short Mystery Fiction Society. If you're not a member of the Short Mystery Fiction Society, join today. It's free. It's a great organization. You'll hear a lot about markets. You'll have conversations about craft. You'll be able to participate in the Derringer Awards, which are major awards given for short mystery fiction. And one of the benefits of belonging to the Short Mystery Fiction Society is the markets list that, as a matter of fact, for the last couple of months, I've been maintaining. I've been doing my level best to make that the best and most comprehensive list of markets for mystery fiction, every market that I can find. And as a member, you have access to that list. There's also a website called Duotrope, which allows you to track your submissions and notifies you to markets. Duotrope is not free. It costs $50 a year for a full package, but I find it to be worth it. There's a free version called Submission Grinder that, again, notifies you of new markets, allows you to track your submissions. And then just Facebook, Twitter, Google. You have to be careful with this, because I don't know what experience other people have had, but my experience of social media the last couple of years has been hugely destructive. It's a swamp, and I have dedicated a lot of time to honing my Facebook and Twitter lists so that almost everything I see through those platforms is focused on writing. If you can do that, it's worth doing. You'll hear about markets. There's a gentleman by the name of Maxim Jakubowski who edits anthologies in England, and I've been in a couple of his books. He doesn't post open calls. All he does is post to his Facebook friends, hey, I'm looking for femme fatale stories or whatever. You probably will never hear about that market unless you're linked to him on Facebook. You can do Google searches. Mystery fiction calls. You're not going to find a lot of things, but you'll find things often enough to be useful. And again, I want to emphasize, I'm talking about this because where you want to publish is going to determine how you're writing. So there's no reason not to start at the top. The top markets in this field are obviously Alfred Hitchcock, which is edited by Linda Landrigan, and Ellery Queen, which is edited by Janet Hutchings. Don't be afraid to aim for these. I had my first story published in Alfred Hitchcock 10 years ago. It was the first professional story I had ever sold. It was the longest of long shots, but the long shots sometimes come through. They each publish 6 issues a year, 15 or 20 stories per issue. They get hundreds, if not thousands of submissions, certainly hundreds of submissions a month. So yeah, it's a long shot, but why not? They pay, which is always nice, 5 to 8 cents per word, depending on exactly who you are and so on and so forth. They're run out of the same office, but handled completely differently. If you submit to one, the story is not going to be seen by the other. And in terms of predicting which one you should send to, it's a roll of the dice. There are those who say that Ellery Queen is a shade more literary and Alfred Hitchcock is a shade more oriented toward genre type stories. But if that difference exists, it's slight. I'll say this. I've had stories rejected by both publications that were then accepted by the other. So take your shot. The one thing to keep in mind here is, particularly with Alfred Hitchcock, if you send a story to Alfred Hitchcock, you can expect that you're not going to hear anything for 12 to 14 months. That's a long time to have a story out of circulation. So you have to take that into consideration. Ellery Queen these days runs closer to 3 or 4 months. But if anything, I personally at least find Ellery Queen to be an even tougher market to crack. Another strong contender, Mystery Magazine, which used to be known as Mystery Weekly, edited by Carrie Carter. This is, to me, just a notch below Hitchcock and Queen and moving up fast. What's nice about them is they publish regularly, once a month. I guess that's why they changed the name from Mystery Weekly, although personally I think Mystery Magazine is so generic that it's not as strong a title, but they know what they're doing. They pay well, they answer quickly, they publish regularly. First of every month, new issue comes out like clockwork. And they just recently doubled their pay from 1 cent a word to 2 cents a word, which is an indication to me that they're doing well and finding a niche. They're also starting to do special projects, like they did a hardcover anthology of humorous mystery stories. So that's a great place to send your fiction. Then there are a lot of other periodicals. I've listed a few of them here. In my experience, all of these are good. All of them are worth aiming for, and all of them can be problematic for different reasons. Irregular publication, low pay, if any pay. Small crime and mystery magazines come and go pretty quickly. So the 12 that I've listed here, they exist right now. The Strand is probably the most visible. You'll see that on newsstands at Barnes and Noble, for example. The Strand only publishes 4 or 6 issues a year and only 4 or 5 stories per. And the other thing about the Strand is they do not answer submissions. You'll just never hear from them. You won't get a rejection. It'll just disappear. So 6 of one, half a dozen of the other in terms of that. But these are all still worthy of your attention. They often have limited submission windows, but if you pay attention to them, keep track of them, they can bring a lot of attention to your work. Sean Cosby, who's maybe the hottest name in crime fiction right now, won an Anthony Award a couple of years ago for a story that appeared in Tough, which is an online-only publication. I have a kind of preference for print publications because, again, I like that shelf with all the books. But e-publications are definitely out there and should definitely be part of your game plan. Then I wanted to put this out there because I just like telling people about this. There's a magazine, literary journal called The First Line. They publish 4 issues a year, and for each one, there is a first line that you have to use in your story, but then the story can go any direction from there, and they're open to any genre. They announce these lines. They just announced the lines for next year. So for example, the next deadline is February 1st, and every story must start with the line, Raina sat in front of the mirror, removing her makeup, and wondered who she would discover underneath. What I find valuable about the first line is that it works as a writing exercise. It's a great writing exercise. Here's a first line. Can you base a story on this? I try to do all 4 every year, and I've actually been accepted for publication a couple of times. It's just a great writing exercise in terms of making you think in terms of short fiction. It's also an example. There are some literary journals that are open to genre fiction, and you can find those by, again, joining the Short Mystery Fiction Society and so on and so forth. I'm trying to go quickly here. If anybody, well, I guess I can't hear anybody, but anyway, I'll take questions at the end.
Say you can take your time. I mean, I'm not in a rush.
Yeah, okay, I am rushing a little bit. Thank you. So those are periodicals. The other major category obviously is anthologies. And as you can see on this slide, they're a pretty varied bunch. These are a few of the anthologies I've appeared in recent years. Die Laughing, the one in the center there, is the one I was just talking about that came from Mystery Weekly, Anthology of Humorous Mysteries. They're selling that sucker for $75 on Amazon. I don't know how many they're selling, but there must be a market out there. I know that Jackie also has a story in the Now There Was a Story book just to the right of that, which is stories based on Johnny Cash songs from a specific album. Other anthologies, Cemetery Plots of Northern California is an interesting example because that's published by Sisters in Crime Sacramento, their California chapter. I don't live in California any more than I live in Memphis, but particularly since the pandemic started, I've joined Sisters in Crime local branches all over the country, and I now have stories in several of their anthologies. If you're interested in publishing as much as you can, if you've got a lot of stories coming out, these are gold. Join the local organizations, keep an eye out for the local organizations. Keep an eye out too for opportunities like BoucherCon publishes an anthology almost every year. The next BoucherCon is going to be in Minneapolis. There's a call right now for stories set in Minnesota and the upper Midwest for that anthology. Deadline is the end of the year. That's a great book to be in because it's very visible. Everybody who goes to BoucherCon is going to get a copy of that book and see your name. There are also anthologies which are invitation only. And that's another place where the networking thing comes into play. If you put your stories out there, if you get a reputation as somebody who can be counted on to produce, you'll start to get those invitations. The Marx Brothers book on this slide is a book that I was invited to participate in. So particularly given the relative dearth of periodicals which focus on mystery fiction, anthologies can be very important to your career, if you will. I'm a little hesitant to call this a career because it's obviously not what I do for a living, but you get the point. So a quick overview of some anthology pros and cons. anthology will usually give you a starting point, and I'm going to be talking in a few minutes about why I think starting points are important. There will be a theme, an image, a place, a song. There have been a lot of, there's been a wave in the last couple of years of anthologies based on songs by particular artists: Joni Mitchell, Billy Joel, Jimmy Buffett. Often anthologies will be like, we want stories set in a particular place, or we want stories dealing with a particular theme. Gives you something to start with so that you're not just staring at a blank screen. It's an opportunity, again, networking, to work with editors and other writers. I've met a lot of great writers by being in anthologies with them. There's usually relatively fast publication on these. That's not an invariable rule, but again, with Hitchcock and Queen, if you get a story accepted by Alfred Hitchcock, you've probably waited 12 to 14 months, and then you're going to wait another 12 to 14 months before it's actually published. Anthologies will usually come out much quicker than that, but not invariably. Again, variety. Every anthology is about a different topic, gives you a chance to write a lot of different stories. This one is a little less certain, often, but not invariably, less competitive. Again, Hitchcock is getting hundreds of stories a month. An anthology is likely to get a really popular one, couple hundred, depending on who it's open to exactly. Something that's open only to the members of a particular Sisters in Crime chapter is they're only going to get submissions from that group. So overall, it's less competitive. Now, that said, there are some cons. Low pay, often no pay, often royalties, but you're not going to make much on royalties. It can be a struggle to reach readers because many of these anthologies come from small presses. They don't have enormous marketing budgets. You'll be expected to participate in promoting the book through Facebook and Twitter and so on. There is a risk of frustration. I wrote a story a couple of years ago that I really liked that was custom designed for a specific anthology, which still has not come out. And there's some question now as to whether the publisher is even going to continue being in business. And the story was written for such a specialized anthology that, as indicated in this next point, you write to a very specific theme for an anthology. That story can be difficult to place elsewhere if it isn't accepted. And also, it's easy to miss the calls, which is another reason to join the Short Mystery Fiction Society, which is something I'm really trying to push here. A quick aside about contests and awards, which in my mind are also associated with anthologies. There are some annual contests, such as the Al Blanchard Award, which is for stories set in New England. The Black Orchard Novella Award, which is novellas written in the spirit of the Nero Wolfe stories. The winner of that contest is always published in Alfred Hitchcock. There are also a number of, so those annual contests are just something to keep an eye out for and be aware of. Number of awards, obviously, for mystery short stories, Edgar, the Anthony, the Agatha, and so on and so forth. For the most part, you have no control at all over whether you're going to be nominated for those, but what you can do is make sure that you are eligible. Make sure that the voters know that your stories are out there, and that can accomplish quite a bit. Just being nominated for one of these awards is an honor that, for the rest of your life, when you are asked to write, your bio for an anthology or the back of the book, say, well, I was nominated for such and such an award. And then, of course, there are the two best of collections. Mysterious Bookshop presents the best mystery stories of the year. It edited by Otto Penzler, and Best American Mystery and Suspense, edited by Steph Cha. What you can do with these is make sure that they know you exist. If you publish a story in Hitchcock and Queen, they're going to know about it. But if you do publish in a smaller anthology or a literary journal, it's a good idea to send it in to these groups just so they're aware of it. Even if you're not selected, they both have lists in the back of honorable mentions. Just being on that list can be a real boost for your career. So I've talked about why I personally write. I've talked about where I want my stories to appear, which means that I can finally move on to, okay, given that those are my goals, how do I go about doing that? And I want to talk about that in some detail, but first, some ground rules. These are basic things, but they provide the framework that enables me to do the writing. Be professional. Every editor I've read an interview with or talked to has horror stories about writers who refuse to accept rejection, for example. And be absolutely clear about this point. If you write short stories, you are going to get rejections. And for the most part, there's no need to ever do anything about them. If somebody sends you a rejection, they don't want to hear back from you. They've got a full email inbox anyway. Read and follow all guidelines. Again, this seems basic, but it's something that editors tell me they are continually surprised by. Every publication, every journal, every magazine, every anthology is going to say, here's what we want in terms of formatting. Should your name appear on the story? And every editor will tell you that they get dozens of stories that don't follow those rules. Quite often those stories go straight into, I was going to say the trash can, but since this is all electronic, they just get deleted. It's pretty easy to do. When in doubt, use shun formatting. I've got a URL there. It's just a basic format for how to format a piece of fiction. What I do is I keep one running list of interesting upcoming deadlines. So I have a list that's literally open on my desktop 24/7. And it's just a list of upcoming deadlines for anthologies or magazines. It's got 30 or 35 things on it at any given time, running from the end of this month up through next summer. And then another running list of your stories. The title, length, submissions, results. The little table here is a small piece of that list for me. This is just what works for me. When a story sells, I turn it red, make a little note. But I think it's very important. And again, I hear from editors, a lot of writers don't do this. They lose track of where was a story submitted. They'll submit a story to a place it's already been rejected from. Keep track of what you're doing. And then this is the most important thing, at least to me, set goals. My personal goal is to have at least 10 stories out for submission at any given time, including at least one to either Alfred Hitchcock or Ellery Queen. I don't always manage to keep that up. Sometimes you get 3 rejections in a day, and that knocks you down to only having 8 stories out. But it's the goal. It's what you're shooting for. And for me, it's personally important to set a higher goal every year. So I think the most important thing is, again, and this is an idea I think I've mentioned before, know why you're writing. What do you want to achieve? What is your measure of success? Entirely aside from, is this story going to get accepted or rejected? How many stories do I want to write? What kind of stories do I want to write? What will make me feel like I'm doing what I want to do? Which finally brings us to the nuts and bolts, how to write short mystery fiction, or rather how I write short mystery fiction. I feel more like an explorer reporting back, this is where I've been and this is what I've found, than I do a teacher, because I still very much feel like I'm learning how to do this. So take the things that I'm going to say here as, this is what works for me, and if any of this works for you, it makes me very happy. So for me, every story starts with a seed, a small moment, an image. And I have a couple of my stories here that I'm going to be talking about that exemplify some of these things. So one story was Edda at the End of the World. I wrote this story originally for an anthology of stories set in Florida. I have been to Florida twice in my life for a couple of weeks, so it's not like I had a strong foundation for this. So I thought about, what do I have to say about Florida? What sticks in my mind in terms of Florida? The two things that I kept coming back to were, as a boy from the Midwest, I had a very strong sense of Florida as an unreal place where it just seemed like a movie set. I mean, there are alligators and palm trees, and it all seems unreal. I can't come up with a better word than unreal. And then the second strong impression that has stayed with me from my time in Florida, the sunset at Key West. It's one of the few, we've all had the experience of tourists. You go someplace and it doesn't quite live up to everything you've heard. Sunset at Key West lives up to everything you've heard. And I encourage everybody to see it once in their life before the ocean rises and Key West is no more, but that's a different story. So thinking about this story set in Florida, the seed was these two things: Florida's unreality, and then the sunset at Key West. And I knew that what I wanted to do was build a story around a character seeing that sunset. Driving through Florida, having this sense of unreality, and ending up at Key West. That's all I had to start with. I knew that this story was going to be driven by character. I wanted to come up with that character. Who is this person? Why are they at Key West? Why have they gone there to do this thing? How is it related to a crime? That's the starting point. Everything else goes from there. By contrast, the other story that I've listed here is Crime Scene. This was written for an anthology of stories set in Dallas. I've been to Dallas once for one weekend for the BoucherCon in 2019, back when we could go places. So I thought, again, what are my impressions of Dallas? The strongest impression I had of Dallas, because I spent most of my time in the hotel, but I did walk over at one point to Dealey Plaza, the most famous crime scene in American history. And I had some very distinct impressions of the place. It's much smaller in reality than it is in the American imagination. It's you look at the grassy knoll, you've heard your whole life about the grassy knoll, and it's about the size of your average suburban front yard. They actually have, I found this surprising, that maybe a lot of you have been to Dallas and seen this, but they actually have on the street outside the book depository a couple of X's on the pavement to show the spots where Kennedy was hit. And in the 20 or 30 minutes I was there, I saw a couple of dozen people go out into the street to take selfies on these X's, even though it's an actual street with traffic. There are cars and buses coming, but people would just wander out into the middle of the street to take these pictures. So if I'm going to write about Dallas, I'll write about Dealey Plaza, because I've been there and I have some sense of the place and I have these impressions that I can use. Okay, we'll have another crime take place in Dealey Plaza. I decide we'll have somebody get killed on the anniversary of the assassination. Etta at the end of the world is driven by character. I know from the beginning that crime scene is going to be driven by plot. These are the seeds that I start with. And that's literally all I have at the beginning when I sit down. The next step is to put in some people. So for Etta, everything is about character. So I spent a lot of time thinking about this character. I wanted somebody who was on the run, but for sympathetic reasons. This isn't somebody trying to get away from having robbed a bank. This is somebody that you want to root for. But they're going to Key West because it's the end of the world, which is a feeling that you have there. That's where all the roads end. There's no place further to go. So this nebulous person starts to take shape in my mind, somebody who's going there out of hopelessness because it seems like an appropriate place to greet the end of the world. So I'm still not sure at this point about the outcome or the form of the story, but I have a character, a middle-aged woman, kills her abusive husband, goes on the run, heads for Key West. I don't know what's going to happen to her, but I'm developing a character that I like. With crime scene, again, everything is about plot. So I'm not thinking in terms of complex characters. We've all read assassination stories, and this is, at the end of the day, genre writing, which doesn't mean it can't be creative and literary and powerful and move you, but it does mean, I think of mobsters and bank robbers and brilliant police detectives. These are to us what dragons and orcs are and vampires are to fantasy writers. They're types that you can play with, and hopefully you'll do something novel with them, but you know what they are. So since I'm writing an assassination story, I want an assassin. There are a few ways you can go with this. Is he going to be a young guy doing this for the first time? Is he going to be an old pro and we'll make this a one last job story? I decided to go the old pro route, and I decided to go with a guy who's done this for a while and he's starting to wonder why he's doing it, which maybe gives the character a little extra wrinkle, maybe gives you a little something else to kind of sink your hooks into while you're writing. It adds a little specificity to the character while still keeping him in that type. So again, all I've done so far, I've got the seed, I've got some people. This is how I think of the process. Starting from that seed, you begin to build the structure around it. I think of this as being the wire frame inside some kinds of sculpture. You build a wireframe and then you start to pack things onto it. The wireframe for me is a very rough outline that I kind of have in my head. I never write this down. I just have a sense of, okay, we're going to start at point A, go to point B. Here are the points we want to hit along the way. It's very skeletal. And it's flexible. Rather than thinking of this as the wireframe inside a statue, which is fixed in place, maybe think of it as the internal structure of an action figure, where it can be bent in different ways as you go along. So returning back to Etta, my wireframe for Etta was nebulous. I knew that I wanted her to start driving through Florida. I knew that I wanted her to end up in Key West. I'm still not sure what's going to happen to her along the way. So the wireframe for that one is very basic. I have a starting point and an ending point. At that point, you wind the character up and set her on the ground and hope that she has something to say. Crime scene, by contrast, again, plot-driven story. So there are conventional aspects to an assassination story. The target, the client, the go-between, who I think of as the broker, because that's the term that Max Allan Collins uses in his books about quarry. A complication, a resolution. It's a fairly straightforward line from A to B to C. So what you plug those elements in, you decide exactly where you want to start. You aim for some novelty. Try to think of a novel reason why this character is getting assassinated. Try to think of some novel aspects for the various characters to have. But you have this basic outline. The hire, the job, the investigation, the revelation. I have that basic framework in mind. That's my wireframe for this. It's more detailed than the one for Edda, but it works the same way. At this point, start drafting. Sooner or later, you have to sit down and stare at that blank screen and put something on it. So again, here's the way I do it. Start from the beginning, but I try to follow the rule that Kurt Vonnegut had, put the beginning as close to the end as possible. You don't need, this might seem obvious when talking about short stories, but I judged a contest last year that had about 200 entries. And it's astonishing how many short stories have 10 or 12 or 15 pages of backstory before anything that's actually connected to the story happens. We don't need to know usually where your guy went to high school or how he felt about his first wife or whatever. This is, I think, the key point. I didn't really write fiction until I was 40 years old, even though I wanted to write fiction from the time I was a teenager. And this is kind of the key revelation that enabled me to start writing for real. And it might sound obvious or silly, but when I fully realized this, it was just empowering in a way that freed me to write. And it's this: everything is going to change. Once you really realize this, it's so tremendously liberating. You can put anything you want on the page because you're going to have any number of chances to change it and build on it and adapt it. The way I think of this is you've got that wire frame and I'm just packing clay onto it. Detail, scenes, dialogue, character descriptions. Some of that will be carved away. Some of it will be changed, but it's liberating. Be playful. Go ahead and drop something in there. Let your character say something that you don't know why they're saying it. Maybe it'll get cut. Maybe it won't. Maybe it will lead you in a new direction. I think this is really something, I'm not trying to oversell this, but this really did make the difference to me in going from writing one story every couple of years to, so far this year, I've written 23. It's a huge difference. In terms of the actual mechanics, I follow the Hemingway method, which is, this is what Hemingway recommended for writers. In every writing session, stop at a point where you know what's going to happen next, because that way, the next time you sit down to continue writing, you can just get started right away. You're not spending the first couple of hours staring, trying to think of that perfect first sentence. And begin each drafting session by reading over and actively revising what you've done so far. I find this, again, to be absolutely key to my process. I don't do individual drafts as such. And thank God for computers, which make this process possible. You can save different versions of the file if you want to, but me personally, I almost don't bother with that. I go through the entire story every time I sit down with it, and every time I find things that I want to change and adjust. And of course, what you're also doing is adding things that will connect to things that you've written since the last time you sat down. Again, this might seem like an obvious point, but it took me a startlingly long time to realize this, which suggests that I'm not all that bright. But for a long time, the thing that kind of kept me from writing mystery stories was, how do I think of clues? How do I think of plot points? This guy has a butterscotch wrapper on page 2, which turns out to be vital to the investigation in page 15. It took me a really long time to realize, he probably went back to page 2 and added the butterscotch wrapper. You don't have to think of all these things before you start. So layering on the clay is the vital next point. And I want to talk about Etta again for a second, because this is a paragraph from Etta. This was on page 2, I think, of the story. I had her driving into Florida. I had her stop at a hotel. And then the paragraph goes, Etta only glanced at her as she walked by. This is a girl at the swimming pool at the hotel. But the clearly defined bruises on the girl's upper arm jumped at her like they were lit up in neon. She'd seen their match often enough in her own mirror, 4 angry purple blemishes perfectly staking out the shape of a man's hand. The girl's arm was the most real thing she'd seen all day. This was originally intended to be the spark of a flashback. It was originally intended to be a moment where Etta would start thinking about her own relationship with her husband and what led her to kill him. But I never intended for this girl to be anything. I never intended for her to be seen again. But as the story developed, the next morning she knocked on Etta's door and asked her to go buy beer for her. I wasn't expecting that to happen. And I realized that it's not tremendously useful to just say, see what your characters do, because you do have to think of it. But because of the kind of story Etta is, because it's this character-driven story, I can make these kinds of changes. The original intention for Etta, the kind of wire framework, was just she would drive from point A to point B and have flashbacks along the way, telling her story, and then we'd find out what happened to her. But as it turned out, the story became about Etta and her relationship with this girl and what they do because they meet each other. Completely different kind of story, but ultimately a much more successful story. And again, you're just layering on the clay. I wrote that paragraph not knowing what was going to happen with it. It could have ended up that it would be cut, but it ended up being the seed of the rest of the story. Crime scene, by contrast, again, we've got that wire structure. It's pretty clear how it's going. There's a clear road from A to B to C, so your job is just to make that drive interesting. So for example, in a lot of stories about assassinations, there's the broker character, the guy who hires the go-between between the client and the assassin. Try to do something different with that. In my particular story, I made that character a young woman who is taking over the business, the family business of being a broker from her father after he suffers a debilitating stroke. Hopefully that makes the character a little more interesting, gives her a little more to do, and it also ties in to the overall theme of the story, which is this assassin is, reflecting back on his career. Does he really want to do this anymore? That's one of the lumps of clay that we lump on. The description of Dealey Plaza, drawing on my experiences there. Hopefully that's a point of interest for the reader. And then not to, I don't want to spoil the story, but an interesting revelation of motivation, interesting method of completing the job. Try to surprise the reader at some point along the way, while at the same time keeping in mind, we're just layering on the clay. Then revision, in my opinion, is where the real writing happens. So in part because of my personal style. I come from the kind of noir school. I'm, Hemingway, Raymond Carver, Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett. A lot of my personal style is aimed at concision. So most of my revision is trimming, taking things away. And to return to that mental image, this is where I'm carving on the clay, take away everything that isn't a horse. If you have 6 words and you can make it into 5, do that. Your style may be different, but I still recommend that all writers approach revision by looking for the clutter, looking for the things that can be eliminated. And sometimes these are things that you're not even conscious of. I sent a story for an anthology to the editor, Josh Packer's great writer, fantastic editor. It was 5,500 words. And he said, okay, this is great, but I've done a little editing. He had cut it down to 5,000, eliminated 500 words and nothing that was in any way essential to the story. A lot of it was just so-and-so walked across the room and opened the door. You don't need them walking across the room. If they were across, it's obvious that they did that. So-and-so looked at the door and X came in. You can just say X came in. I look back at that edited story from Josh pretty often because to me it was a masterclass in what do you really need? And this is obviously particularly important for short stories because for both aesthetic and practical considerations. The aesthetic considerations are obvious, but the practical ones can be just as important. If you're sending a story into an anthology and they have room for a 3,000 word story, but not a 4,000 word story, there's an obvious advantage of being the guy who's writing the 3,000 word story. Read out loud. This is an important part of revision to me. It's just a couple of weeks ago, I had my first chance to read some of my fiction out loud. So I read a story out loud that I was planning to use, and I came across this little passage here where somebody hands somebody a piece of paper where something is circled in red. It read, now when I read it out loud, red and red just clanged against my ear, but that's something I never noticed on the page. There's a real value to reading your book, reading your story out loud, seeing how it works. Look for overused words. There are word count sites on the web where you can paste in a piece of prose and it will tell you, it will calculate how many times each word appears. It's always surprising. I mean, you expect the and, but it's always surprising to realize, wait a minute, I used sparkle 6 times in this story. Clearly, I've got to replace some of those. So when you're cutting all this stuff away, what do you add? Connections, setups for things that are going to happen later in the story, callbacks to earlier details. This is where you bring it together into a coherent whole. And as I say, this to me is where the real writing happens, because this is where you take all that stuff that you've clumped onto that wire frame and make it into an actual statue, or I guess the metaphor I'm using here is action figure. It's at the same time, you have to realize you're never really done. It's just you get to a point where you have to turn it in. I don't think any piece of writing ever reaches a point where it can't be improved, but it reaches a point where there's the law of diminishing returns and it's time to let it go. So this is the last point I want to make, and it's not maybe related to short stories specifically, but it's the thing that I've become most convinced of over the last couple of years. The more you write, the easier it becomes to write more. It's natural to think the more you write, the better your writing becomes, and that also happens. But I never would have imagined a few years ago that I would be capable of writing 20 stories in a year, because who has 20 ideas? But as you write, the ideas, at least in my experience, become easier to access, because you start thinking, well, what if this character did this instead of that? Or maybe what if this character was a woman? How would the story develop differently? Ray Bradbury said that a short story writer should aim to write 52 stories a year, a story every week, because nobody can write 52 bad stories. I know some writers who probably could write 52 bad stories, but that's a side point. Ray Bradbury, of course, also had the great advantage of living at a time where there were a lot more paying markets than there are now, but setting that aside. Volume, keep writing. Every story you write puts more tools in your toolbox. So that is the somewhat anticlimactic end of my presentation. So thank you. And I'll turn it over to Jackie or whoever, or, there you go. I'll shut up now.
Okay, so
Thank you very much. Thank you, Joseph. I mean, a lot of
Oh,
really
I went
good advice.
way too long there, didn't I?
No, actually, we only had 10 or 12 people leave, so it was fine. No, it was wonderful. And actually, it was pretty much what I expected from someone who knows what they're doing. Thank you so much. I can only be seen here a little bit. There is a question in the chat box. Dutch wants to know, where can he get copies of what you have written? And this, let me add a corollary to that. Lynn, is it possible to put all his slideshow on the website so people can go back and take a look?
yeah,
That would be awesome, because to me, there's a lot there. And also, Etta is on Apple Podcast.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Etta at the Edge of the World is really, at the end of the world, is a fabulous story. It's one of the first that I read of his. And so I went back and read a whole bunch more based on that short story. And I remember what you read there. I remember thinking, holy cow, she is going to get into a mess now. She's going to take So for me, that was the aha moment. I'm not exactly sure how, I didn't remember it quite like that, but that was my aha moment. There are all kinds of ways you can look up what he has written. One of them is to go on Amazon, just plug his name in, and there will be, poof, a bunch of books. Joe, can you put in the chat for us how to sign up for the Short Fiction Mystery Society?
The Short Mystery Fiction Society, if you just Google Short Mystery Fiction Society, you'll come up with it. I don't think I have a specific link for that. I will put in the text in the chat there. There's a link to my website, which lists my stories and where there are links to, where you can buy them or see them.
Yeah.
But the Short Mystery Fiction Society, it's important to make a distinction. There is a Facebook group, but just being on the Facebook group doesn't make you a member. You have to go to the groups page and actually join. But again, it's free, and it's, Jackie, it's a very valuable resource.
And I just want to point out that I have said this, given the same speech about the Short Fiction Mystery Society several times, and only when it comes out of your mouth does it seem like it's impressed people. So I'm really happy that you said that, because it is a valuable resource, and he has compiled a markets. It's wonderful. It's a terrific resource for markets.
I'm always looking for more.
But you forgot one thing that I wanted to ask you about and how you address this, because I've had a problem with it myself, which is you submit to, when you read how to submit, they say, simultaneous submissions, okay, just let us know if you get it accepted. So I send out a couple of stories, and then I get an okay, I want to buy this. Then I have to go back and resubmit, and people get I've had one person get a little testy about it. So if they don't want it, why do they put simultaneous submissions okay? Have you had trouble with simultaneous submissions?
I have not, because I don't do them. I send a story to one place and I don't send it anyplace else until it gets rejected, which, does happen frequently enough. That's just my again, I'm trying to turn out as many stories as I can. So for me, if I've got 10 or 12 stories out, I don't feel like I need to send a specific story to 2 or 3 different places. I can afford to wait.
Okay.
Because I probably, the other market that I would send it to, I probably have another story that I can send them.
Okay, fair enough.
I do agree with you that if they say simultaneous submissions are okay, they shouldn't give you grief about it.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. But as you know, it does you no good at all to argue with an editor.
No.
That is the worst thing you could possibly do is argue.
You want right. You want the editors to think of you as somebody who's easy to work with.
Right.
Joe, as a novel writer, I want to thank you for validating the process I think all of us go through in describing how you put a story together. I think, and knowing that there's a name for the Hemingway method, it's nice to know that. It's like, I think somewhere I read in a book where somebody said, an Italian said, nepotism, you mean they have a name for it? Well, thank you for the Hemingway method.
Okay.
Well, I'm sure the things that I do are the things that most people do, but it was helpful to me to formulate it.
Yes. I think you need to take this show on the road. In case you all have not figured out, I love to read his stuff, and I think he's a wonderful writer. So thank you very much, Joe. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to shift now into business mode, and I'm going to call on our treasurer, Barbara Christopher.
You want me to shut down Facebook?
Yes, please. Thank
Okay.
you for reminding me. Yes.
Mhm.
Okay.